Thank you very much, and I can't thank you enough for inviting me back to Reading here tonight to give this lecture. It's a real honour and privilege to come back here to Reading. And this lecture is a particularly poignant one for me in terms of coming back to Reading. And I'll explain why, because this is sort of thinking I've been doing for a little while on this, and I was thinking I'm putting together and hoping to write a book about it at some point when I get a spare moment or two, which is probably a little while off, but anyway, hope to do it at some point. But it's all based on a moment that I want to share with you. And it's a moment that happened here in Reading, funny enough, when I was here as an undergrad doing my geography degree in 1991, I think it was, in the first year then. And I don't know if you recognise this, this is Market Square, and I took this photo this afternoon, so this is absolutely raw, and it's one of the many excuses I use for being over time and sending the slides in to the organisers tonight. But this moment was really a profound moment for me, because what was happening is in our first or second year here, there was a group of us, and we sort of joined up with the local Friends of the Earth, Reading Friends of the Earth group, and were campaigning one day about air pollution. Back in 1991. And what we were doing that day is handing out leaflets about air pollution, just there in Market Square. It was pretty innocuous, really. We weren't dangling from the buildings or anything like that, literally just handing out flyers saying that there's a problem with air pollution and we've got to tackle it, basically. And I don't know if any of you have ever done this, handing out flyers. The interesting thing is as you do it, you can't help yourself but profile people as they come towards you, to try and assess whether they're going to be interested in what you're handing out or not. And you just do it automatically. It's very hard not to. And sure enough, most of the day, people were coming up and they were taking the flyers from us politely and walking on. Sometimes you'd spot people and you think, yeah, they're going to stay a bit longer. And sure enough, they'd be really interested and ask questions and all these kind of things. And about halfway through the day, this guy starts walking up to me. And I remember really vividly, he was a sort of fairly tall bloke in his late 60s, I would guess, and he was walking towards me with his cagoule done right up as far as it would go, even though it wasn't a particularly cold or rainy day or whatever, and that was kind of like, he looked angry. He was one of those people that had a face that always looked permanently angry. And as he was kind of walking towards me, I without even thinking about it, I started to withdraw my hand, because I thought this guy's not going to want to take one of his leaflets. But as he came level with me, he nonetheless turned at me and he shouted in my face, "You can't stop progress." And it was a really interesting kind of heckle to get as an undergrad, just trying to hand out leaflets about air pollution on the street in Reading. There was I, thinking what I was doing is probably quite a good thing to do in the scheme of things, fairly socially useful thing to do, hopefully. There was this other guy who equated more cars absolutely equaled more human progress. And he saw me as an enemy of progress by trying to stop that. And it's a thought, it's a moment that's really stuck with me all those years since. Because I think it actually gets to the heart of a lot of the debate we have in society about the changes we need to make, about how we might learn to live fairly within environmental limits. The whole kind of environment debate is encapsulated, I think, in that little exchange that I had in Market Square back in 1991. Because there are many people in society that might think all this kind of environment stuff is terribly important, but what a shame it gets in the way of progress. And I think if you really stop to think of it, and I hope over the next 45 minutes or so, you can come on a bit of a journey with me as we work through this, we'll come to realise that it couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, what I want to try and convince you of tonight is that learning to live fairly within environmental limits is the next step of human progress. In fact, it's what progress is all about. And if we succeed, then that is incredibly exciting. It is the next step in the history of humanity. And if we don't, well, arguably there isn't a next step in the history of humanity. There's three big questions I want to ask tonight as we go through this. The first is, what is progress? Very important. Secondly, how are we doing? The third, what next? So let's start with that one. what is progress? And when I was here at Reading, you know, I was taught you've always got to start your essays, be clear about your definitions. So let's make sure we do that. What is progress? Well, this is what the Oxford English Dictionary offers, 2 definitions. The first of these, forward or onward movement towards a destination. That's not what we're talking about tonight. Clearly what we're talking about tonight is development or betterment towards an improved or more advanced condition. It's that second one that we really assume when we have these kind of debates about progress. And Sidney Pollard, the historian, wrote in 1968, the assumption that a pattern of change exists in the history of mankind, and apologies by the way, there's occasionally uses of the word mankind and man tonight by other people that have written quotes, and I have to use their quotes faithfully, but not my choice. A pattern of change that exists in the history of mankind, that it consists of irreversible changes in one direction only, and that this direction is towards improvement. That's what was going on in the mind of that guy that heckled me on that day in Market Square. That there is this pattern of change that can only go in one direction. So you have to ask yourself the question, through human history, where did we first come to think of progress like this? When did the word progress, or where did the concept of progress even first come about? Anyone want to suggest something? So I would have thought that. And as has been said, I'm a geographer and I'm not a historian. In fact, I didn't even do history GCSE because stupidly back then I couldn't do history and geography, so I chose geography. It was the right choice. But anyway, but I'm not a historian at all. So, but I really wanted to explore this, and I was very lucky that for 3 months before I became Chief Exec at Friends of the Earth, I was given a sort of 3-month sabbatical, and I got a policy fellowship at the University of Cambridge, which was just a fantastic thing to do. I was able to spend 3 months going around talking to some of the top academics and just having amazing conversations with them, and didn't have to produce any essays or anything. It was just bliss, it really was. It was wonderful. And I tried to explore this topic. Where did the word progress come from? How did it mean this concept? And so I went right across the university, and I met up with Professor Simon Golding, who's this amazing professor of ancient Greece and things like that. And I asked him this, and I said, so in ancient Greek times, was there a concept, as we understand, of progress now? And he furrowed his brow, and he looked at me and said, absolutely not. He was kind of like if in the movie of this, he'd be played by Simon Callow. You know, he was that kind of guy. He said, absolutely not. And he said, in ancient Greek times, they didn't even think of themselves as being in an era. Yeah, so I'm just quoting him here. I can't see whether this is right or wrong, but I'm hoping, you know, he knows. He says, in ancient Greek times, they didn't even think of themselves in an era, and this concept of progress, that perhaps the future would be better, was not there at all. In fact, quite the opposite. The sense in ancient Greek times was that if you were going to get the best things, it was mostly to go back to what had been there before. And a lot of the art and the statues and so on was about celebrating the past as opposed to the future. He told me. So I thought, well, so I said to him, well, where do I go next? He said, well, I think you need to, he said, that was still true even in the Renaissance. And he was saying, you know, the Renaissance was all about the rebirth. People were still going back to thinking about, look, can we amass the best of what had come before? He says, I think you need to talk to someone about the Enlightenment. And of course, as you know this in academia, you go to experts and they all tell you they're the wrong person to speak to. You've got to speak to someone else. So I finally, and I'm cutting out a lot of steps in the process here, I finally got to these amazing historians about the Enlightenment, and then they suddenly said, oh, yes, well, this is pretty much when we first started thinking about this, because the Enlightenment was the first moment in human history where actually, and I'm talking about Western civilization here, of course, where we actually started to think of ourselves as in an era and could reflect on that. And of course you had, for example, this Dutch philosopher who was a big figure in the Enlightenment. And, you know, he's got something called the fable of the bees, so I've got to put that in. But he talked about man's perpetual desire for ameliorating his condition. In other words, this first writing about how can we strive to improve the condition of humans. And many of you, all of you, I'm sure, would have heard of the famous theorist of Adam Smith. And in his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he asked, what are the advantages which we propose by that great purpose of human life, which we call bettering our condition? Now, interesting enough, in his more famous book, The League of Nations, he then went on to talk about probably what was very important for improving an individual's betterment, if you like, better of the life, was the material possession of goods. But he also said that it wasn't the goods per se that necessarily brought happiness, it was the status that was equated with them, the status of being higher than others around them, and so on. It's some of the things he said in that. And the other thing, though, is in also the League of Nations, he went on to then talk about how his concerns about that this could lead to ever-growing inequality in society and would cause problems for what we would now say progress longer term. Of course, there was also Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher, and he offered a really strong critique of this. He really worried that this constant striving for betterment, and particularly inequality in society, would lead to big problems in society long term. So he was writing that even, 300 years ago. But sure enough, this is when you first started having this thinking in an objective way about what we might now call progress. Of course, it was in the Victorian era when we really started to associate progress with the advancement of science and technology, when suddenly there was this explosion of science and technology. And of course, there was empirical evidence, quite rightly, to suggest that this improved people's lives. I mean, it's quite logical, really, isn't it, that we'd come by this logic? Because if you think about it, the club, if you're a hunter in Stone Age times or something, a club is obviously more effective than a fist, and an arrow is more effective than a club, and then eventually a bullet is more effective than an arrow. So there's an absolute empirical evidence that science and technology does improve lives and so on, and we saw that all the time, which is why in the Victorian era we really started to link the two together. Science and technology equals progress and material consumption with that. But it's worth kind of reflecting. There was this great sort of Canadian writer that wrote a book called The Short History of Progress. I'm going to read a little bit from it later as well. He's made this comment: we no longer really give much thought to moral progress. This is a prime concern of sort of earlier times, except now, post the Victorian era, we just assume it goes hand in hand with the material. He also writes, our practical faith in this Victorian notion of progress, based purely on technology and materialism, has become an ideology, a kind of secular religion, blind to the flaws in its credentials. So let's ask the question then, well, what are the flaws in its credentials? What are the potential flaws in the concept of progress? Well, Ronald Wright talks about this great concept called progress traps. The whole problem that societies time and again will become focused on the thing that delivers progress for a while, and then they think it will always deliver progress. So I gave the example before about the club being better than the fist, and the arrow being better than the club, and the bullet being better than the arrow. But of course, what's next? The next step is that the nuclear missile is better than the bullet. And then you start to see that there is this thing of progress traps. You go in a certain direction for a while, and it does improve things. It does lead to betterment of society. But then, actually, it leads you into a very seductive trap. We have this all the time, and in fact, there are such things as sort of, if you like, evolutionary traps. Anyone can give me an example of an evolutionary trap that we all suffer from? I know I do. Several. Well, sugar and fat, yeah? We've all been coded in our DNA because of how we evolved, that when we see sugar and when fat is available, we want to hoard it, essentially. We want to take it on in case we can't have it next time around. The problem is now there's an awful lot of it around for us. And it's really hard for us to kind of reprogram ourselves to think that maybe we don't need those biscuits this time around. I mean, some people are better than others. I'm in the others category. But sugar and fat and all those kind of things, we find it really hard. And societies are the same. There's these things these progress traps, these things that actually, time and again, have been useful for us to a certain extent, but then we get stuck in them. And we carry on deploying them, thinking that they will always deliver more progress, when in fact, they become that kind of seductive trap and actually hold societies back. Now, if you think I'm just exaggerating this a bit, well, let's look again at history, what history can tell us, and let's look at the history of two previous civilizations. The first is Easter Island. Now, the kind of Christmas cracker response as to why the Easter Island population collapsed, why the civilization collapsed, is one of overpopulation, ecological collapse. But that's not really quite the whole story. It was in the early 1700s when the Dutch fleets first came across Easter Island in the South Pacific. And they came across it and it was this barren landscape, not a single tree on it, hardly any vegetation, and no one living there either. But there were these amazing stone statues, sometimes 3 times the height of houses and so on. And of course thinking, well, how on earth did they get there? Captain Cook, when he first saw Easter Island a little later, he said, I think he said, nature has been sparing of this place. So the whole sense was it was completely barren and impossible to really understand why these statues were here. But it was through pollen studies, and I was delighted that in the geography department, when I went back there this afternoon, I heard a little bit about pollen. I got very excited about that. Used to do lots of stuff about pollen when I was here. And it was from good old pollen studies of lakes on Easter Island that finally the answers started to come out. And it turns out that Easter Island was, of course, once a lush, tropical forest-covered island originally. And it was first kind of settled probably around 5 AD, but by 500 AD, incredibly successful civilization there, with around 10,000 people living there. Villages, effectively what we now call a town, and it was a very, very complicated society. It had lots of hierarchies in it. It was divided up into sort of chiefs and clans and so on. A really kind of a big hierarchy within the island. But the pollen studies also show that by 1400, it was all the trees had gone, all the vegetation has gone, and there were no longer people living there. So what happened? Well, the evidence suggests that on this island, as they went through progress, what they did is start to honour their ancestors. And to honour their ancestors, they created these stone statues. But with all the competition between the chiefs and the clans and so on, over time, they competed via these stone statues. They wanted to build ever bigger stone statues. In fact, from parts of Essex, where I grew up in, it still goes on with stone lions and things like that. You kind of still see this happening, okay? People trying to compete with the size of different statues and so on. And actually, you could call it South Pacific bling. These different chieftains, these different clans were competing to do this. And whenever they were facing problems, then the chieftains would just say time and again, we just need to build a bigger stone statue and that will solve all our problems. So they became fixated on stone statues as a kind of token of progress, as an indicator of progress. You know, nowadays we're fixated with gross domestic product. Back then, it was the size and height of these statues. And whenever we have these problems, all we have to do is just fell more trees and create more ropes to put ever higher statues, until, of course, the last tree was felled. And that was the end of that civilization. Easter Island fell into a progress trap. Ronald Wright talks about this. He says, the people had been seduced by a kind of progress that had become a mania, an ideological pathology, completely obsessed that these stone statues were the solution to delivering them the kind of progress they needed. You look at the Mayan population, the Mayan civilization, and again, on the surface of it, it looks like there was a collapse of this incredibly successful civilization that happened just over a century or so, and that it looks like it was a collapse of overpopulation and ecological concerns and so on. But actually, archaeologists more recently have come to see that there was a huge inequality in that society. And they can tell that by looking at the bones of people living in that society at the time. There were a handful of very tall and quite weighty individuals who were the people in charge, the elites, and the vast majority of people were clearly starving. But what they were saying, what the evidence suggests, is constantly they were just saying to deliver real progress, the more problems we have, the more we have to collect, gold trinkets, and we have to get more and more gold and build ever more temples, and that will do this. And as the crisis got ever worse, so this endured. So this is the bit I wanted to read you from Ronald Wright. As the crisis gathered, the response of the rulers was not to seek a new course, to cut back on royal and military expenditures, to put effort into land reclamation through terracing or to encourage birth control, means of which the Maya may have known. No, they dug in their heels and carried on doing what they had always done, only more so. Does this remind you of anyone? Their solution was higher pyramids, more power to the kings, harder work for the masses, more foreign wars. Reminding you of anyone yet? In modern terms, the Mayan elite became extremists or ultra-conservatives, squeezing the last drops of profit from nature and humanity. So isn't it funny that even in the Mayan population, when everything was going in the wrong direction, a lot of their political leaders just says, well, the problem is we need to go faster. We need to do even more of what we've done before. And so that's the evidence as to why that civilization collapsed. I'm sure if there's any historians in the audience, they'll correct me afterwards about all the details I got wrong. But nonetheless, what you see there is through the history of these previous civilizations, there's real evidence that whole civilizations can fall into these progress traps, become obsessed with the thing that might have helped them for a bit, but then becomes a trap, a seductive trap that then becomes their downfall. So with that in mind, we have to ask ourselves, how are we doing? How on earth is our amazing, globally connected civilization doing now? I mean, it's pretty amazing, really, isn't it? I mean, it's ridiculous for me to be standing here and comparing it to Easter Island and the Mayan civilization. We have extraordinary sort of 7 billion or so people living on the planet. We're globally connected. You can phone anywhere. We have amazing events that bring us together, like Strictly Come Dancing. We have amazing things that just are symbols of surely humanity getting further than ever before, particularly Strictly. On the surface, it looks amazing. I mean, yeah, there's a few 100 million people going hungry every night, but most of those 7 billion people are getting fed. We've expanded everywhere, and so on. How have we done it? What's different? Well, there are two big differences that this civilization has had. I mean, there's many more than two, but there's two really big ones. One is actually we've migrated from our areas of where this current civilization first developed and so on. We've actually ended up migrating, connecting different civilizations. So we've been able to go beyond our carrying capacities. So this time round, we've gone right up to the carrying capacity that is the planet. Of course, we've ended up exceeding it, but that's the story I'll get onto. But no longer have we been trapped, say, just in Europe, or just on an island, or just in Africa, and so on. And that's why, a big part of European civilization and how it grew and succeeded is we started empires and went off and colonized other areas and expropriated their natural resources to enable us to keep growing because we'd passed the carrying capacities that we'd got to. That's how we kind of expanded. Equally, the other trick that we've played is we've borrowed all this kind of energy from previous millennia. In other words, fossil fuels. That's a trick that other civilizations didn't have. That's been unbelievably important. The whole Industrial Revolution based on fossil fuels. And we did it by taking energy that was captured from the sun thousands and thousands of years before. Incredibly clever, really. But I mean, that's the way we've exceeded otherwise, because some of the carrying capacities that had been faced with earlier previous civilizations. But the question then hangs there, are we experiencing any progress traps? And I would say, of course, they're staring us straight in the face. They're in front of us every single day. I'll list you just a few. And again, I've got to put bees in because we've had this fantastic collaboration, this work between Friends of the Earth and the University of Reading around research on bees that we've been very grateful for, and it's been really important for our campaign on bees over the last 6 or so years. So really want to pay testimony to that. But what that research has shown from the University of Reading, and of course right around the world, is the shocking impact of industrial agriculture on our pollinators. Now, industrial agriculture, I would say, is a progress trap. Of course, agriculture has been one of the whole reasons we're here. It's been an enormous success for the human race and has enabled the emergence of our civilization. I'd even go as far as saying that elements of industrial agriculture have been very useful. But we now obsess about it still. Our whole agricultural economy obsesses with industrial agriculture almost still as if it's the only answer. Because yes, it delivered in the past, so it must deliver again. Even though the research is very clear, and I know soil science is a huge thing here, so again, I'm a bit nervous that I'll be corrected. But as I understand it, 1/3 of farmland globally has been degraded since the 1950s. There is real evidence that modern industrial agricultural methods, at least some of them, are a progress trap. But as a society, we're really failing to address that, even though it's staring us right in the face. And what about nature more generally? Is not our subjugation of nature, has that in itself not become a progress trap? The fact that humans, we're all part of nature, we're totally dependent on nature, and yet we now see ourselves distant and apart from it in a way that's contributing to increases in mental health problems and so on. All those kind of issues. Fossil fuels, of course, are a huge progress trap. You probably didn't come here tonight and think you were going to hear me say thank you to fossil fuels, but I don't mind saying that. Of course the industrial revolution has been incredibly useful. Of course we wouldn't turn back the progress that the industrial revolution delivered and the medicines that came with it. But we should have said thank you and goodbye to fossil fuels a long time ago. But the whole way in which our society is now wired, it's almost impossible to do so, or it's proving very tricky. We're getting there now, thank goodness. And of course it's fossil fuels that had led to climate change and is now starting to bite back. What about plastics? Awful lot of attention recently. It's one of those funny things about campaigning. You can campaign on something for years and no one's really interested, then David Attenborough pops up and suddenly they are. Just as we dial down our plastics campaign, we're now dialing up again, quick! Oh, and by the way, if you go home tonight and you want to sign our petition on plastics, just Google Friends of the Earth and plastics. It will take you straight to our petition. Please, please do sign up. But what we're seeing with plastics now is really scary. Because what's really clear now is plastics don't biodegrade. I mean, full stop. They break down, they get smaller, but they don't biodegrade. So the shocking thing is that all the plastic that's ever been produced still exists in one form or another. I mean, some of it's been recycled. I mean, yes, some of it was burnt, not much. But astonishingly, all the stuff that's been made is pretty much still out there in the environment in one form or another. And when I say don't biodegrade, yes, they break down into smaller pieces, but the evidence is really clear now that those smaller pieces are starting to clog up the digestive tracts of even the smallest animals. So people are aware, because of Blue Planet and so on, about turtles, seabirds and others and whales that are eating plastics and the huge problem that causes for them. But actually tiny microscopic pieces of plastic are being found clogging up the digestive tracts of plankton and diatoms and so on. This is really scary. We don't know quite where this leads to. We don't know about what the ticking time bomb of this is going to result in, because the problem is most of the plastic that's in the oceans now is associated with plastic that was produced in earlier decades. But in the last 10 years, we've produced more plastic than in the history of humanity combined before that. And most of that hasn't reached the oceans yet. We don't know quite where that's going. So what are going to be the long-term implications of that? And so what's the solution to this? Is it bottle return schemes? Yeah, that'd be useful. Plastic bags? Yeah, that'd be good. But no, actually the only real solution is to stop using plastics, to phase out plastics completely. And you kind of think, he's mad. is absolutely mad with plastics in our everyday life. We can do coffee cups and we can do, you know, plastic bags and things like that. But to phase out plastics completely, but it's very clear it is the only answer. And you might think I'm mad saying that, but 15 years ago I would have stood here and said we've got to phase out fossil fuels, and everyone would have thought I was mad then. The fact is, sometimes you're confronted with the science and the evidence, it's really clear that that's the only way to go if we're going to solve this problem. So let's get to it. Let's work out. Let's stimulate the amazing science and research and innovation to work out what the materials are, the benign materials are that can replace plastics. And let's get on with it sooner rather than later. The problem is plastics are so present in our everyday life. They are now a progress trap. They helped us for a bit, but now they're a real problem. And now we're addicted to the damn things. So we're finding it hard to move on and say thank you and goodbye to plastics. And here's the real killer. What are plastics made from? Fossil fuels. So the fact is, if we're phasing out fossil fuels anyway, we've got to do that. If we don't phase out plastics as well, you end up with the absurd situation that we might have to carry on doing fossil fuels just to make plastics, which really wouldn't make much sense. So we've got to get on with this. But there's such a time delay, even when we try and have these debates and discussions before the wider discourse and politicians catch up with this. So what about air pollution then? Or what about cars? And more to the point, the internal combustion engine, really. The very issue that caused that guy to heckle at me back in 1991 in Market Square. Let me ask you a question. Does anyone know, according to the government's own statistics, how many people in Britain are dying prematurely every year because of illness associated with air pollution? 40,000, yeah, you all know, don't you? Very educated audience. 40,000. 40,000 people, 50 if, depending how you count it, which particulates and so on you include. But around 40,000 people dying prematurely because of air pollution in Britain every year. And the reaction I've got from you there, as I said that, is the reaction I always get from audiences. It's like, I'm not blaming you. We all do that. Imagine if we came at this lecture here tonight and put on our phones, radios as we're driving home, whatever, and there was a news flash that there'd just been this announcement from MI6 that a Middle East dictator had some terrible plans to kill 40,000 people in Britain this year. Do you think we'd all just go, Do you think, how would the papers respond if, when that security service briefing came out, that 40,000 people at risk from this Middle East dictator or terrorist group, how do you think the newspapers would respond if the government's response was, this is terribly important, so we're going to have to set up a consultation about how to deal with it, and we're going to deal with the problem over 20 years? But here's the curious thing, isn't it? Here's the curious thing. When it's us causing the pollution, when it's humans causing the 40,000 premature deaths, it's actually much easier for us to solve the problem. We know how to solve this. We have the technology. We know exactly how to solve the air pollution problem. And in fact, we can know exactly that a series of outcomes will lead to, a series of steps will lead to that outcome of solving it. And yet we don't do it, really. And yet, suddenly if someone else, if a foreign power was doing this to us, we absolutely would. It's curious, isn't it? That cognitive dissonance. And it's because the internal combustion engine is a classic example of a progress trap. It's been incredibly useful. Think what it's delivered for us as a society. But even now there are very good alternatives, and by the way, we could have had those alternatives a lot sooner if we put our mind to it. We're still now struggling because of the incumbents, the technological incumbents and cultural incumbency that goes with technology that has been very useful to us. But to put this in perspective, I need to say 40,000 premature deaths in the UK. How many in China? Anyone know? So it's 500,000 people in China die prematurely every year because of air pollution. 7 million people worldwide. The World Health Organization estimates it's 1 in 8 deaths globally caused by air pollution. And yet we know, really, how to tackle it. I mean, that's not just from internal combustion engine, that's from a number of sources, but we could solve it if we wanted to. A lot more predictably than maybe a foreign war or something. Oh, sorry. What about this one as a progress trap? You know, material consumption. We are a society now that assumes that buying more material goods will make us happier, essentially. We all do it. I do it. None of us are immune from this. We all do it. Get a special offer, of course we want to do it. But is there any evidence that, taking Britain as an example, we've got happier over the last few decades as we've gained more material goods? No, there's not. Happiness in Britain has arguably flatlined, or some people even think in some cases declined over the last few decades. But there was one year that was an exception. Does anyone know where happiness had a mini peak fairly recently? 2012, did someone say? Exactly right. And do we know why? There were two reasons why Britain was suddenly a lot happier in 2012. One was the Olympics, the other was the Queen's Jubilee, exactly. So it's none of that stuff, actually. It wasn't the emergence of Black Friday or anything, which I think was also that year. It was actually the Olympics and the Queen's Jubilee suddenly made us happier. So by that logic, we should be doing that a lot more frequently. But isn't that extraordinary? And so again, of course, and I'm not denying, of course, that if you have nothing, you'll want this stuff, and of course it will bring you more happiness to a certain level. Of course that's obvious. And I'm not going to rehearse those arguments because that's all obvious. But the interesting point is what's the next step of human progress? Is it for us to get more stuff? No, it's not. The evidence would suggest. What about technology? Now, I'm certainly not going to say to you that technology in itself is a progress trap, because I absolutely believe technology will play a huge role in enabling us to live fairly within environmental limits. But perhaps our current relationship with technology could be a progress trap. I mean, for a start, there's extraordinary incumbency, actually, in a lot of technology. Think about planes. So my son, William, loves planes, absolutely obsessed with planes, which again is kind of interesting challenge for my personal brand, but anyway, that's all part of the fun of it. He absolutely loves planes. And actually, you know, I admit I do as well, a little bit. But isn't it funny to think that the Wright Flyer happened in, what was it, 1905, I think. And then extraordinary innovation happened in planes between 1905. It was only by the 1960s, you know, you had Concorde came along. That was an amazing short period of time. You go from the Wright Flyer to Concorde. And then the jumbo jet and so on. But actually the innovation you've seen since then to now hasn't been so amazing, really. I mean, you've seen some incremental improvements in efficiency, you've seen some clever things here and there. But no, we haven't suddenly gone to electric planes, although I'm very excited that that is on its way. That's another thing. But why is that? It's because you've had technological incumbency. You've had airlines that spend a lot of money on planes or leasing planes and so on, and these airliners will last 30 years and so on. So it's hard to bring in new technology that way and so on. So actually there's all kinds of these arguments that in that sense innovation has slowed down. The same way you see this all the time. You see this with the vehicles. That's the whole point. The biggest problem for the entry of electric vehicles in the mass market now is not electric vehicle technology or even charging points. We can get over that. It's the presence of the internal combustion engine. So the incumbency of some old technology is a real progress trap. How can we retire old technologies and move on perhaps a bit quicker if the new ones don't come with the problems associated with the past? But the other thing to think about in our relationship with technology is, to date, pretty much, if something's been new technology, as a species we've kind of thought, great, that's amazing. To give you a really highbrow quote here, if you think to Jurassic Park, which was on when we were here at Reading in the early 1990s, you remember that character played by Jeff Goldblum, Dr. Ian Malcolm, I think his name was, and they're sitting, that scene where they're sitting around having dinner and Richard Attenborough is telling them about how he created these new dinosaurs. And he says this amazing quote. He says, "You were so busy trying to work out whether you could do it, you didn't stop to think about whether you should do it." And I would suggest to you that if technology is not going to become a progress trap for the human race through the 21st century, we have to have a mature approach with technology and not like a child in a sweet shop wanting it all. we've got to really think carefully about what's the technologies that will help us and what are the ones that might harm us in one form or another. And taking the example of artificial intelligence, I think it could easily be either. It's how you do it that is the answer to that. It's the regulations you put in place to make sure artificial intelligence, does it help humans or does it harm humans? But we've got nothing like the kind of mature debate or discourse or policy thinking going on in society at the moment that enables us to do that. Maybe so, maybe it will come. But fundamentally, if it's not going to become a progress trap, that's what we've got to be able to do. And then what about inequality? I'd say another huge progress trap that our current civilization is facing is growing inequality. You know that statistic that the richest 1% of the global community owns more than the rest of us, supposedly. And this is poignant, isn't it? Because what was really clear from those stories of Easter Island and the Mayan civilization is that inequality played a huge role in driving the collapse of those civilizations. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that growing inequality in our current civilization will cause all kinds of problems as well. The interesting thing is this is Ronald Wright who wrote that amazing book, and what I'm trying to do is take the debate on a bit further than that. He has this point that the problem is that our current civilization is bigger, more globally connected, 7 billion people, more than Easter Island and Mayan population. And as he puts it, the problem is that every time history repeats itself, the price goes up. So the progress traps we face now, whether it be fossil fuels and climate change or biodiversity loss and so on, are affecting the whole globe, not just a little area. So the first thing we have to do, I would suggest, is recognise in answering that question, where are we now, that we do have these problems, these progress traps. We've just got to acknowledge that and recognise them for what they are. And recognise that history can repeat itself. And there's no fundamental reason why this current civilization couldn't go the way of Easter Island and the Mayan population unless we get smart about this. So that brings me on to the final question, where next? And the thing that there are some tantalizing, hopeful reasons as to why, if we're smart about this, we could be the first civilization to break those progress traps. This amazing thing happened in the 1960s, as you know, 1970s, for the first time humans went out into space. And they looked back at planet Earth, and for the first time, I mean, that shift in global consciousness was profound, that suddenly we had that recognition that we were just living on this island, actually not so different to Easter Islanders after all. And it's no coincidence that very soon after that, that's when the modern environmental movement formed. Groups like Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace and plenty of others emerged after that time as a result, really, of that kind of change in public zeitgeist. And what I find exciting is we could be the first generation or group of generations over the next few decades that actually thinks globally, that thinks about how we can work together, communities around the world, to solve these global problems. Humanity has shown time and again throughout existence, over 10,000 years, that we can be incredibly clever. The big point, to coin a phrase from this chap, the big challenge for us in the 21st century is not just to be clever. We've done that plenty of times over. As a human race, we've got to be intelligent, and that's a slightly different thing. Clever is building really clever machines. Intelligence is making decisions as to whether, how and when we use them. And the systems we have put in place, the governance systems to enable that. And the intelligence we need to drive the change, to be able to live fairly within environmental limits. And again, there's lots of reasons for hope here. If you look at some of the things that have happened in just like the last 100 years or so on, communities do come together and campaign for change. Whether it's the civil rights movement or, as we've celebrated recently, the suffragette movement. Amazing moments that deliver real, lasting steps in human progress. It deliver real betterment for huge numbers of people. And what we're seeing now is we're seeing people coming together around the world campaigning for real progress. And what inspires me in this job more than anything is meeting the people that do this and constantly asking myself, is this person I'm meeting here, this ordinary person doing extraordinary things, are they the kind of person that one day future generations will build a statue to remember? Take, for example, this amazing woman, Tina Louise, who's been campaigning against fracking up in Lancashire for the last 6-7 years. When I first met her 5 years ago, and there's one of our leaflets there, that's nice, not seen that before. When I first met her about 5-6 years ago, she'd never campaigned or done a protest or anything like that in her life. She'd never done that. She'd worked in the media and media consultancy and things like that. She'd never done any of that. But she'd moved to this beautiful part, the Fylde, this beautiful part of Lancashire for the later parts of her life, and she became a grandparent, and for the beauty of that landscape and the peace and quiet of that part of the world. And then she heard that fracking was coming, and she wanted to campaign against it, and she started to read up more and more about it and read to the links to climate change and got involved with Friends of the Earth. And what's happened to her over the last 5 years is she's gone from someone that would have been terrified to stand up and speak to 3 people, that now she could walk straight in here now and give you the most passionate and inspirational speech you'd ever hear. Absolutely amazing how it's transformed, and she's become a leader in her community and a big national figure now in campaigning against fracking and leaving fossil fuels in the ground. And I meet people like this all the time, really inspiring people. And I find myself thinking, are they the people that in 100 years' time they've been making Hollywood films about? I'm sure they will be. This amazing woman, whose daughter died because of air pollution. She lives in London. Daughter died because of air pollution. And so she's set up this foundation in her name, Ella Robertson Foundation, and campaigning on air pollution issues. And amazing how someone can be transformed after the most heartbreaking loss you can imagine, to turn this into something positive in campaigning for change to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. These are ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Well, this amazing woman, Juliet Davenport, who set up Good Energy, that many of you may know, because she was fed up with the big old energy companies addicted to fossil fuels, and she wanted an alternative, a company that would offer renewable energy and power on that. So she set up Good Energy, and now, of course, it's one of the larger energy companies in the UK, powered entirely by renewables. And the reason is her vision, very simply, is renewable electricity is the future. I agree with that too. New Scientist put it very well just two years ago in a editorial they had. They said one day the whole of humanity will be powered by renewable energy. We can all have an argument whether that's going to be in 20 years' time, 50 years' time, 500 years' time, 5,000 years' time. But ask yourself this question: if that's where we're really going to end up, why faff around with all the other stuff in the meantime? It's very strange, isn't it, to delay progress with all these other things, fossil fuels and so on in the meantime. Sooner or later, all our cars will be electric, and there'll be such better cars as a result of it. Much better cars. But we've just got these kind of messy, incumbent internal combustion engines in the way in the meantime. So why is it we're so slow now at sometimes recognising the next step in progress and actually making it happen faster? And bear in mind, this is in a context where the electric vehicles of today and the renewable electricity of today are equivalent to the brick-sized mobile phones that we had when we were here at Reading in the early 1990s. In fact, we didn't have, of course. Some people had, but very few students had them back in the early 1990s. It is so exciting what the future looks like for electric vehicles and for renewables, but we can't even predict it. We just know it's really exciting and it will be transformational. And yet, still, as of today, in the G20, governments are giving 4 times the amount of public subsidy to fossil fuels as they are to renewables. What about recognising real progress as something that focuses on the things that really matter? What about putting nature back into people's lives? Look at this amazingly exciting idea of taking London and turning it into a national park city, and taking whole tracts of London and putting wildlife there to improve people's quality of life. Just because you live in a big city, why should you be distant from nature? Why shouldn't you have nature on your doorstep? It would dramatically improve quality of life. This is real progress, focusing on the things that really matter. And those are the lasting thoughts I want to leave you with tonight. Real progress comes from focusing on what really matters. Not the trinkets of progress, not the indicators that we've used that perhaps worked in the past, but focusing on what is really needed to give people meaningful, fulfilling, enjoyable lives, and to do that as with many people as possible. And of course, real progress is also progress that lasts, not that goes the way of Easter Island or the Mayan civilization. And that means progress that includes learning to live fairly within environmental limits. And that, I would say, is the next step in real human progress. And anyone that's supporting that are the friends of progress, and the people that are against it are the real enemies of progress. So I hope you join me in becoming a friend of real progress. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Well, I mean, this question comes up quite a lot, and I know that the population issue does worry a lot of people. The thing about this is that the impact of population on the Earth's resources is not just a factor of how many people there are, but also of how they consume those Earth's resources. And the fact is we in the West, in the global North, consume many times more resources than people in the global South, in the poorer countries. And so if we're going to have any conversation about reducing the number of births in the global South, I think it has to at the very least be coupled with us dramatically reducing the amount of resources we consume in the global North. That's really important, I would say, at the very least. Secondly, what I would say is actually the evidence on this longer term is quite good, in that there's all kinds of trends as to why global population hopefully would peak at around 10 billion. Now, it would be better for the planet if it peaked a bit sooner than that. I absolutely agree. But then you have to think about what's really effective in doing this. What is it that has really, where's the evidence that shows that something works to reduce birth rate? And it's actually all about access to education and rights for women and girls. That's what really makes the difference. That, time and again, and empowering women around the world, providing access to education and so on, is what brings birth rate down. So that's the answer. That's really what we have to do. Yes, you can have conversations about contraception and so on as well, but the evidence is really clear that women's empowerment and rights for women and girls globally is what will make the biggest difference to that. So I'd say let's all get out there and campaign for women's empowerment. Thank you. Well, first thing I would say is the reason I do focus on those statistics for the UK is because it's proximate to us, and it's the best way of opening up encouraging us to explore our cognitive dissonance on this. No, well, I think it is because they're not all end-of-life deaths. You know, of the 40,000, you know, as I said, 40,000 deaths where air pollution has been a contributing cause and so on. The problem is you don't put air pollution on the death certificate, you know. But just for a moment, give yourself a thought experiment here. We often talk about the winter crisis in the NHS, yeah, and of course that's for a whole number of reasons. But there will always be a winter crisis in the NHS for as long as we have air pollution and as long as we have people going cold in homes that are poorly insulated. I mean, there's loads of other issues as well.
Yeah, and average life expectancy goes up.
Yeah.
You'd be 93 instead of 83.
Yes, but I mean, surely progress is solving the problems we can solve. You know, so let's get on. We could solve this, is my point, if we chose to. So why don't we choose to? That's my main point. Now then, your point about India. You're absolutely right. You know, I've spoken to an audience here tonight that's a UK-based audience, and I've just invited you to try and think about these issues in a way that's most relevant to us. Of course, it will be a very different experience for people living in other parts of the world. However, what I would suggest to you is that real progress is not going from a wood-burning stove in India to propane. It's going from wood-burning stove to stove powered by renewable electricity, which therefore can be captured on the roof of that house in India on a decentralized grid and which is happening right across India now and happening right across Africa, and then giving people real energy freedom as well. And rather than necessarily having to follow the steps that other societies have followed, that I would suggest is the real progress. And I suppose the point of my talk here is to suggest that if we're going to get smart and intelligent about progress, it's to learn from our mistakes as we go along and find a better path for progress. I completely agree. That's why I quoted Professor Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park. Very important. I completely agree. We have to think about these things very carefully. And you know, with any solution, there will be problems associated with it as well. That's why, you know, let's make sure electric vehicles don't become the next progress trap. I mean, I think they're a heck of a lot better for all kinds of reasons than internal combustion engine, but yeah, they will have problems as well. So let's work on that from the outset and try and avoid those. So I agree. The point is, the real point here is not to say that's that solution or that solution. It's to change our mindset and approach to this so that we are not as lazy as a society as we've been in the past, where we just think there's a solution and let's not kind of question some of the problems associated.
The answer is actually application of many technologies.
Of course, and we don't know how they will interact, and they can interact in really exciting transformational ways or in bad ways. So we don't know. That's why we've got to be eyes wide open to all this. That's my number one point.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I get asked this question time and again, essentially a variant of, well, what can I do? Yeah, and that's perfectly understandable. You hear about these challenges. But what I was trying to show there at the end is that everyone can do something. Okay, I gave some examples of some ordinary people doing really extraordinary things. But the most important thing is to do something. And actually, it's not for me to tell you what to do. You know, the really exciting thing is you got however many people in here tonight that will all have a different idea about the contribution that they can make to this debate. And some people might take actions around the home and make consumer choices in one sense. Other people might try and influence politicians. Other people might be in business and try and influence the future direction of their business. These are all great. These are all really good things to do. And so people should do the thing that they think can be their biggest contribution to this. Now, you're right. I don't believe for a minute that this is going to be solved just through changes in consumer behaviour. We need really governments to act here. We do need governments to put in the long-term regulatory frameworks to address a lot of these issues. That's why Friends of the Earth campaigned a decade ago for the Climate Change Act to try and actually enable that long-term shift away from fossil fuels and for tackling climate change here in the UK. Yes, we need those kind of levers. But ask yourself this question: how many times really do politicians genuinely lead and say, here's a crazy new thing that we've got to do, and I'm going to say it before anyone in the public has said it, and how much do they really follow? In my experience, I've come to decide most politicians follow, and they act when the public shows that they care about something. So the really exciting thing about, you know, using your keep cup, yeah, is not just the plastic that won't be used when you get your next coffee. It's that when thousands of us are doing it, business and politicians start to think, oh, people care about this issue, and then they think about the bigger legislative levers they can pull. And I've seen that time and again in my career as a campaigner. These things, it's not either or, the two go together. Well, I've said very clearly what I think about that in the media. Look, it's very good to have a 25-year plan for the environment. Of course, you can't solve these issues in 1 year, and it's good to be thinking about where you want to go over 25 years. Of course, politically, it's the easiest thing in the world to talk about all these things that have got to happen when you're probably no longer going to be in office, particularly for a government that questionably most people are wondering is going to last 25 months, let alone 25 years. So 25-year plan is great to have, but the only way we're going to build trust and confidence that it's really going to be delivered is what this government does in the next 25 weeks. And the problem is today, despite the 25-year plan, the government has been in court trying to oppose what is legally required of it on tackling air pollution. Next week, the government has to make a decision whether it's going to give the go-ahead for a brand new open cast coal mine up on the Northumbrian coast. Yesterday, David Davis said, all these fears that Brexit might result in a bonfire regulation go unfounded. They're not unfounded. Just last week, Boris Johnson was saying how wonderful it'd be that when we Brexit, we won't need to do environmental impact assessments anymore. So I think what really matters is actions, not words. And words are nice, they set the context, but at Friends of the Earth, we're going to be watching the government and making very clear our views on things over the next few months to see whether they're starting to deliver on the wonderful rhetoric that is in the 25-year plan, and is wonderful rhetoric, but let's see if the actions deliver on it.
And my final act for today is to invite you once more to thank Craig for his outstanding presentation and just being welcome back to come to the University of Reading.
Thank you very much.